Welcome to the 2018 IBS show. We're at the Plastpro booth, and I'm Gary Katz with the Katz Roadshow.
And I'm Scott Wells with Scott Wells Construction Company and the Katz Roadshow.
And we're here because Plastpro has invited us to come and do a demonstration on how to install doors in an HV/HZ zone.
That's right. That's high velocity hurricane zone.
And a lot of places along the Atlantic coast have to meet those code requirements. The reason that Plastpro invited us is because we've been working with their doors at Katz Roadshow events all around the United States for the last 5 or 6 years. We invited them to participate in the Katz Roadshow because we really enjoy working with their products. Their products are superlative. They make one of the finest fiberglass doors in the industry, and they also make their own jamb. We'll be talking about both of those products later, but let's jump right into the installation of these doors.
All right.
So this is meant to replicate a masonry wall. It's just a set. It's not concrete, but you get the idea here.
That's right. We're using 2x-bucks for this demonstration. You can use 1x-bucks as well, but there's some real advantages to using 2x-bucks. The first one, the main one, is that we can correct this rough opening for cross-leg right from the get-go. We can attach the side bucks nice and firm at the top, flush with the outside of the masonry, and we can move the bottoms of the bucks around to accommodate any cross leg.
Before we install the jamb. Now you can't do that if you use 1x-bucks. If you use 1x-bucks, when you fasten the jamb, the fasteners have to go through the jamb, through the buck, and into the masonry. But if you use 2x-bucks, you can install the bucks first. And like Scott said, you can cross-string them and correct for cross leg before you even bring the jamb over to the opening. So let's demonstrate how we're going to do that.
Cross leg is a problem in a wall where the bottom of the wall is out of plane. It's not in one particular plane or one flat plane. The top of the wall is always held together with a connective header, keeping the top of the wall in one plane, but the bottom can get sort of out to lunch. We have to identify what that is right from the get-go. And I've driven 4 screws, one at each corner of this opening, and I'm going to tie the string to it, crossing the opening.
Now, as Scott's doing that, I'm going to review these fastening requirements. If we were doing this initially live, we wouldn't have the bucks already installed on the wall. Obviously, we've got the flashing on top of the buck as well. But when you first put the buck on the wall, first of all, you want to make sure that you use pressure-treated bucks, pressure-treated lumber, because it's going to be in direct contact with a masonry wall. You have to flash your buck too, and before you put your buck on, you have to put sealant behind the buck. We'll talk about all of that before we assemble the head buck. But the fasteners you use in these bucks are really specific. Plastpro actually makes an assembly instruction that you can follow, and if you look deep into here, you'll find that there's actually a schedule for what size fastener to use and how the fasteners have to be placed, what the center spacing is. For instance, on the bucks, you've got to use 2 3/4 inch by 1/4 inch fasteners, and they have to be how close to the top?
4 inches from each end, top and bottom, and every 16 inches on center after that, at a minimum.
At a minimum. You can put them in more often than that, but that's the minimum requirement. Now, we've only installed the very top fastener. That's all we need, is the sealant on the back of the buck and the very top fastener installed. Then we cross-string the opening before we install any other fasteners. And what we want to see is these 2 strings just kissing each other.
Now, this is a set, and we built this set in Gary's shop. And we're finish carpenters, so we're really particular. We built a really nice set. This wall is perfectly flat, and it's proven by the fact that these strings are just kissing. You'll never see this on a job site. It's basically impossible. Generally, we'll always see a large gap between the strings. You know, if you're lucky, maybe it's only 1/4 of an inch, but sometimes it's 3/4 of an inch. And this is your opportunity to correct this problem, this cross-leg problem. We can move the bottoms of the bucks in and out of the opening before we fasten them until we can bring these strings to just kiss each other.
And then we'll have an opening that's in one flat plane, a single plane, and that's what we're after. Because if we don't correct for cross-leg and get those bucks into one plane, when you close the doors, the meeting stiles on the doors will never meet flat from the tops of the doors to the bottoms of the doors. So we got to kind of move fast. If you can imagine, the sealant is on the backs of these bucks. We've only got fasteners in the top, so we can take the bottoms of the bucks and move them out of the wall until the strings come up close, and then fasten them off before that sealant starts to set. And as Scott said, we'd put another fastener 4 inches from the bottom approximately, and then every 16 inches on center up the rest of the buck. So let's wrap this up real quick. Now the head buck has to be installed according to the specific assembly instructions too, and the spacing for the fasteners is a little bit different. On the head buck, you want to make sure that you find the center of the buck and then measure out 4 inches from the center for the first fastener, and then 8 inches from the center for the second fastener in both directions. You have to have additional fastening right near the center of the buck because the astragal on a pair of doors is going to be secured by that buck right near the center, and you get enormous amount of force from high winds against that astragal. So before you put the buck up, you're going to install it with 2 good beads of sealant on the back of it, just like you would the leg bucks, and then fasten the head buck up with the same fasteners. And what are they again, Scott?
These are 2 3/4 inch fasteners. They're 1/4 inch thick, and they have to embed the concrete 1.25 inches.
You have to have a fastener within 6 inches of the end of the head buck, and like we said, you have to follow the manufacturer's installation instructions, 16 inches on center, plus the extra fasteners in the center of the buck. So now that we've got the head buck in and the legs are in, we can start working on the sill. We want to make sure that the rough opening is perfectly level before we bring the frame in here. And the best way to do that is by installing a pad strip.
That's right. We're installing a 3/4 inch pad strip here. This one's made out of boral, but it doesn't matter what you use. You can use wood, you can use fiber cement, you can use PVC. But the pad strip is really critical. It's going to allow us to level up this opening underneath the door. If we can't put in a pad strip, that means we have to work off of what's already here. And concrete floors and wood floors are rarely ever level. Consider yourself lucky if you ever found one in an open.
And they're not straight. So what we're going to do is use the pad strip to level this opening up. We'll put a level across here.
There we go. Now we can read that vial right in the level, and we can shim underneath this pad strip until the level is perfectly level.
Because if the threshold isn't installed perfectly level and absolutely straight, the doors will never be flush at the tops. So all of these steps are so critical to bringing the jamb, before bringing the jamb over, because there's 2 ways to approach this. You could do this the old-fashioned way, where a carpenter would come in with a tube of sealant and run a couple of beads of sealant right on the subfloor, right on the concrete opening, and then bring the jamb over and set it in a sealant. And if you do that, you're never going to get it perfectly straight, so you're going to be fighting trying to get the doors flat across the top and flush. And besides, if you go to shim it and you've already got your sealant underneath your threshold, you're going to be sticking shims right through your sealant and penetrating that sealant barrier. And that you cannot do, not in the HVHZ zone, because in this area, in this code requirement, this is based on the barrier system. In other words, that sealant that you put down on that opening has to create a waterproof barrier that moisture cannot get through. And if you penetrate it with a shim, then what's the point of putting a sealant down? So we use a pad strip, and once we get the shims in place and it's level, you can pick up the pad strip, to pull it out of your way carefully, then apply your sealant down right over the tops of your shims and set your pad strip right into that bed of sealant. You'll notice the pad strip also projects out beyond the house, almost an inch or so. That's because we also use the pad strip to support the nose of the threshold. How many times on a rough construction, on a new construction job, have you seen a threshold with a dip in it? That's because there's no support for the nose of the threshold once you install it. If you put in a pad strip, You'll get the additional support of the pad strip to help support the nose of the threshold, so when a guy comes through that opening with a bunch of tools or a cart or a dishwasher and steps on the nose of that threshold, you won't get a dip in the threshold. In order to cover the threshold, we're going to show you a sill nosing trick in just a second. But before we get to that, we got to waterproof this. You got your
It's right there.
here?
Yeah. This is a stretch flashing tape. It's a peel and stick tape, and it's really flexible. If we were to pull the backing paper off of this and stick it right down to our pad strip, we'd be creating a pan. And we could fold our tape right over the leading edge of that pad strip and also right around the corners of the bucks. So we're going to cover the pad strip and the bucks with one piece of tape because it's so flexible and stretchy. Once we've done that, we want to J-roll it right to the pad strip and right to the edge of the bucks, every surface the tape contacts, so we're getting maximum adhesion. This is pressure sensitive tape. In fact, all the tapes that we use today are pressure sensitive. We want to use a J-roller or some sort of pressure applicator to install them and not just our hand.
Now this is a set. We're going to do this presentation 3 times a day, 3 days in a row at the IBS show this year. So we can't pull the release paper off this peel and stick membrane and stick it down to the pad strip, or we'll never be able to do the presentation again. So you got to bear with us here. You got to work with us here a little bit. Imagine that we've left this peel and stick membrane in place as our pad strip. So let's pull this out of the way. The next step after creating the sill pan is to cover it with something so it doesn't look ugly. That's the beauty of a sill nosing. This is the piece of aluminum that Scott just pulled out.
Yeah, this is a sill nosing right here. This is something you can pick this up at almost any big box store, any hardware store, and it's just a piece of aluminum that's been molded and bent at a 90-degree angle, and the finish on this will match almost any finish on any door you might buy. They make it in brass and antique and satin nickel, and this is a black one. It's going to match the threshold of our door nicely.
So this is dark bronze, and you notice it's got about an 1.5 inch nose on the front, little leg on the front, comes back about 4.5 inches. We can set that right on top of our pad strip, and then the threshold will sit on top of that. So let's install that right now.
Now most guys right now would be tempted to squeeze off some sealant right on top of this and bring that door frame over and get started. But not us, not yet. We still want to correct the rough opening for width. It's going to make the installation so much simpler if we do.
And if we put a bead of sealant down here, I'll be sure to step in it. You'll probably put your knee in it. This is just one of those things you don't want to do prematurely. We're not ready to put the sealant down yet. Like Scott said, we've got one more job we got to do. We've got to correct the width of the rough opening.
Now you can use tapered shims to do this if you want to, but I prefer to use plywood shims. I've got a little stack of them right here, and they're multiple widths, multiple thicknesses I should say. We pick these up from job sites and we cut them on the table saw and the miter saw, and we end up with these little squares. And we use plywood that's a 1/16 inch thick, 1/8 inch thick, all the way up to 3/4 in wood frames. But in this masonry opening, this has to be a pretty clean opening because we're only allowed a 1/4 inch of shim room. You can see right here, we've used an 1/8 inch shim at the top of this opening and about a 1/4 inch shim at the bottom, just to get this buck plumb. That's what we're shooting for here, is a plumb surface, because these rough walls are not plumb and the buck is secured tightly to it. So we've got to make that correction right now.
And when Scott said we're only allowed a 1/4 inch of shim space, that's to meet the HVAC zone code. And this is no joke. That's why these openings, the rough opening itself, has to be pretty close from the get-go, because you're not going to be able to shim it very much. And the plywood shims really give you a great benefit here, because if you have them in different thicknesses, you can dial down exactly the amount that you need to shim in to plumb up your bucks. Now we want to bring this opening in so it's just over the OD of the jamb.
That's right. The outside dimension is 74 inches on this frame. Let's see what we've shimmed to here. We've got this at 74 1/8, which is about right. We want a little bit of room to get the frame in. We don't want it any tighter than that, or else we'd struggle to get the frame inside the opening.
And now that we've corrected the width of the rough opening, we're finally ready to put 2 big beads of sealant all the way across this opening before the threshold comes in. Now, those 2 beads, the first one's going to be way back here, just inside the inside face of the buck, and the last one's going to be out toward the nose of the threshold. Don't put it out too far, or when you set that frame in, you'll squeeze sealant out and it'll spread right over the top of the sill nosing. So let's set that
Let's set the frame.
When the frame goes in, you just want to get it close. Get your jamb legs so that they're flush to the face of the wall, and then slowly set the frame down on top of that sill nosing so it beds itself in the sealant bead. And then bring the frame up, and now comes the easy part. If you follow the fastener advice that we're going to give you. If you don't follow the fastening instructions we're going to give you, this is not easy. Installing doors can become a real headache. If you follow the fastening advice we're going to give you, it can be fun. So the first thing we're going to do is just pinch this jamb in.
I'm just going to take a couple of tapered shims and I'll put them butt end to butt end, and I'm going to jam it in right next to the head jamb here. Just pinching that head jamb into place, and Gary's going to do the same thing on his side. That way it can't move.
And once the jamb is flush to the wall at the top, I'm going to run in fastener number 1.
And this is fastener number 2.
Both fastener 1 and 2 go very high on the jamb, one on this side, one on that side. Make sure the jamb is flush to the wall first. Now we're going to also want to check to make sure the jamb is flush at the bottom, and we're going to want to put fasteners down here, but not yet. We can't put any more fasteners into this jamb until we swing the doors, because we have to be able to adjust the jambs to fit the doors. Let's bring the doors in right now. Because at this point, we're not just adjusting for cross leg, we're also adjusting for any potential wind or bow or warp in the doors. And let me show you what I mean by that. Scott's going to take his jamb leg.
I've got my jamb leg perfectly flush at the bottom of my buck, and Gary's going to do the same thing. Now you guys saw us cross string this opening, and it's perfectly flat in one plane. Those 2 strings just kissed each other. So in theory, we should be able to put these jambs right flush with the bucks at 4 corners, and these doors should just come together perfectly in one plane. These are the meeting stiles of the doors. And let's close these now.
But the meeting stiles aren't coming together perfectly flat. If you look here, the doors are flat at the bottom, but as you come up, this door is proud of this door by about 3/16 of an inch. A little bit, almost a quarter, a little bit less than a quarter of an inch. Now, why is that? How can that happen? If we cross-strung this opening and we corrected for any kind of cross-stringing or out-of-plane situation in the wall, then the doors should be in there perfectly flat, but they're not. How can that happen? The only way it can happen is if there's a little bit of twist or a little bit of warp in the doors.
That's right.
And there always is.
Do you think that doors are perfect? Well, if you find a perfect door, consider yourself lucky. They're kind of unicorns, to use that phrase.
Yeah, they are like a unicorn. I mean, doors are made by men, and men can't make a perfectly flat door. They're all out just a little bit. So this is a correction that every installer has to make. Otherwise, when you go to close the active door, it won't seal against the weather stripping on the astragal. And the same is true for a single door. You've got to be able to shut the door and have it engage the weather stripping flat from top to bottom. Otherwise, the door's not going to function properly.
That's right. Well, the industry standard on a 6/8 door is that a door needs to be flat to within a quarter of an inch. Anything more than a quarter, you can get your door replaced. But anything under a quarter, that's up to the installer to figure out how to get that door to close right.
If it's an 8/0 door, there's no requirement. I mean, there's no, the door could be out 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, and then it's entirely up to the installer to make sure that door is engaging the weather stripping flat.
So, not only do we want to take this time to correct for any remaining cross leg in the wall, which we've already taken care of that in this case, but we want to correct for that wind in the door by moving our jamb legs around at the bottom of the opening. And because this is a masonry opening, we're really only going to want to move those outside of the opening. So it's really pretty simple.
And this is a really good example of why you want to use a 2x buck. We've got the bucks in, they're fastened off permanently to the masonry, and now all we have to do is adjust the jamb and then fasten the jamb to the buck. We do not have to fasten through the jamb, through the buck, and into the masonry wall. That'd be really tough to do if you want to adjust for any kind of wind in the door.
So all I need to do at this point is just kick this jamb leg out a little bit and take a look up here and see if I've closed up the difference in the meeting styles.
I don't think we need to go that far.
Okay.
It's just a little bit that we're talking about. Perfect. That's
right
nice.
There? Okay.
Perfect.
Now if you make this move on the job and it doesn't make your situation any better, then just bring it back in and kick the other side out. All you have to do is do something on this. You have to move one side or the other, and you'll see if your position improved or if it got worse. Then just do the opposite if it got worse. So now that we've corrected this, before we swing this door open, I'm putting my toe right behind the jamb. We've just manipulated this jamb and put it in a position that it didn't want to be in at first. And I don't want to swing this door open and have the weight of the door push the jamb back inside the opening. So I'm going to keep my toe nice and tight to the bottom of it. And I'm going to fasten off fastener number 3, and it goes down low in the jamb. Now we're using screws because this is a set. And you might use screws on your jobs too, or nails, either way. But we're going to do this over and over, so we're using screws.
So now we want to do the same adjustment on the opposite door. So we're going to check to make sure that we haven't lost it. They're still flat. We could actually kick that one out just a tiny bit.
A touch.
There you go.
You like that?
That's nice.
Okay, I've got my toe behind the jamb.
Swing the door open.
And fastener number 4. Once again,
4
goes nice and low, just above the threshold.
So we've got fasteners 1 and 2, 3 and 4, down low and up high. Now the frame is fixed where we want it, so our doors are flat. Now we can move on to adjusting the gaps.
That's right, because we still have gaps all over the place that don't look just right.
So
the
we
doors
want to
are
talk
still
about
rubbing.
specifically what they are. We want to get the terminology right here. We're after adjusting the gap above the top hinge, so that's the top hinge gap. We also want to adjust the gaps below the bottom hinges, that's the bottom hinge gap. And then we want to adjust the gaps between the doors as well as the gap between the tops of the doors and the head jamb. So let's start with the gap between the top hinges, above the top hinges. On both sides, you're going to always find when you initially get your doors in a frame like this and you get them swinging, you're going to find your top hinge gaps are going to be way too big. And the reason for that is, again, because of the weight of the door. Now watch what happens.
Look right here at the hinge, at the little leaves, not the leaves, but the hinge right here has a lot of slop inside of it. In fact, you can see and probably hear the slop. This hinge is moving on top of this hinge independently as Gary takes the weight of the door and increases it and decreases it.
So you're going to also notice that it isn't just the hinge that moves. If I were to put a little bit more weight on this door, and this door is empty, it doesn't have glass in it. I mean, if this was a regular door with glass in it, it would weigh a lot more, and it would actually deflect the whole jamb.
Yeah, you can see the jamb move right through here.
Not just the hinge, but the whole jamb, and that is what ends up causing a large hinge gap above the top hinge. We got to correct for that before we go any further. The best way to do it is with the screws that come with the jamb. That's that little plastic bag of screws that you find stapled to the back of every single Plastpro jamb and every jamb in the industry when they ship out their entry doors. Now those screws are really important. It's unfortunate, and on most job sites, you found that little bag of screws in a pile of trash in a corner with a bunch of drywall scraps. Use those things. You want to put those long screws through the top of every hinge, and on an HVHZ zone, you got to use one of those screws inside of every single hinge.
That's right. I'll back out one of the screws that's already installed from the door hanger closest to the stop, and I'll install one of those number 9 screws right through there. Now you're tempted, because the weight of the door is so heavy and deflecting the jamb and taking the slop out of the hinge, you're really tempted to just lean on that screw and really suck that jamb back with an impact driver, but you don't have to do that. When the door is swung open, that tension is relieved from the hinge, and since there's no shims right behind the hinge here, it doesn't take much pressure at all to move the jamb back and take some of that weight back towards the buck. Now let's see how we
did. Now we're starting to get a nice gap between the doors here, but I think this hinge gap on my side is still a little bit big. How's yours?
Let's take a look.
Yours is actually a little tight.
Okay.
And let's look at the head gap here and see how we've affected that. It's still the same, so we'll leave Scott's just the way it is.
Okay. Want me to back yours out a little? Or drive it in a little?
Drive that one in a little bit.
Okay. We're talking quarter turns and half turns here. It's so sensitive.
Now we're looking nice.
Okay.
And just a little bit more on this side. Beautiful. So we got a nice gap between the doors at the top. We still got a big gap down here, so now let's talk about that. This top hinge is under tension because the weight of the door is pulling on the top hinge, but the bottom hinge is under compression because the weight of the door is pushing on that hinge. That's why we always see doors all across the country. Everywhere we go,
everywhere we go,
that have no hinge gap beneath the bottom hinge. In fact, some of them are so tight down here that the door is pinching on the jamb. And what happens then is the door ends up being jamb bound, and it just kind of pops open by itself because as you close it, it touches the jamb and just boop, pops right back open. Now, this is a problem that is so common because a lot of door hangers or door installers don't understand that there's a big difference between hanging a door and installing a pre-hung. See, we're not hanging doors here. We're installing pre-hung doors. In order to hang a door, you gotta cut the door and shave it, plane it to fit the jamb. But these doors have already been planed. They've already been bored for the locks. There is no cutting the doors. That's why we have to adjust the jamb to fit the doors. And this is a really crucial point where we have to get the right hinge gap down here at the bottom in order for the doors to not only fit, but in order for them to function. And there's only one way to do it. We've got to install a shim, the first shim. We've got to install up high above the hinge. Now let me explain and show you exactly what I'm talking about. If I put a pry bar in here, just to exaggerate this, and put some pressure on it, look, right here there's no gap. The door is touching the jamb right here. But now, I'm getting a nice gap. Here's a huge gap. I can put any gap I want to right here just by the amount of shimming I put behind the bottom hinge here. Now, this can't be done if you install doors the way a lot of carpenters do. If you take a level and you put it up against the jamb, let's just look at this. If you look at a lot of magazine articles, you'll see a photo of a guy with a level, and he'll be holding a bunch of shims behind the jamb, and he'll have a nail gun in his hand. And the caption underneath the photo will read, "First thing I do once I get the jamb in the opening is I shim behind the hinges until the jamb's perfectly plumb, and then I nail off those shims at every single hinge." Now, if you install your frames that way, you'll never be able to get hinge gap beneath the bottom hinge, and it'll be really difficult to correct hinge gap above the top hinge. And these steps are really important to fitting the jamb to the doors. So now, since all we've done is installed one fastener really low on each hinge jamb, we just have to put a shim in right above that hinge. And I've got a nice gap now. And Scott's going to do the same
There we
thing
go.
on his side.
I've got a gap that matches the very top and the very bottom. They're the same.
And
How'd
look
we do?
what happened. As we put those shims in, we closed up this gap down here that initially was really big because we've taken the compression off the hinge. Not only that,
We've also got the tops of the doors to line up really closely. I might pick mine up just a touch more.
all right.
All I need to do is push the shims in just a little further, not a lot, just a little. Let's take a look. Now they're the same, and our gap between the meeting styles the whole way down the door is the same.
So those are the steps you have to take before you put in any other shims, especially shims behind the hinges. But now we're ready to do that. We're ready to shim behind the hinges, and hand me a pile of
Sure.
shims.
There you go.
Great. We're going to ready to shim behind the hinges. Now we want to do this about every 12 inches. I
Here's some
really
more.
believe in shimming behind the hinges, shimming behind the jamb a lot. And 12 inches is more than the HZ zone requirements. In fact, on the jamb, you only have to put in fasteners every 14
Every
inches.
14 inches and
And they
6
don't have
inches
to
from
be,
the top and
they don't-
bottom.
And they don't have to be 2 3/4 inch. These can be 2 inch. These can be 2 1/2.
They're 2 1/2s,
Yeah.
2 inches through the hinges.
So I like putting them in more often because this isn't a wood jamb. This is a polyfiber jamb. Plastpro is the only door manufacturer in the industry that makes their own frame. There are some frames out there that you can get from other manufacturers that are kind of rot resistant on the bottom
Yeah,
of the
the
jamb.
bottom 8 inches.
But this jamb is rot resistant throughout the entire jamb, which is kind of cool when you're installing a jamb in an HVAC zone in a masonry wall. I mean, it's not wood, it's polyfiber. That's why they call it a PF jamb. It's made out of a combination of wood dust and polyvinyl, like PVC. The advantage is with the wood dust, they can stamp the jamb. They can embed a wood grain in the jamb so you can stain it and it'll end up looking like cherry or Doug fir or oak.
Mahogany.
Or mahogany. Yeah, they're beautiful jambs. So that's why we like to put in the shims every 12 inches. And since we're on the subject of their products, let's talk about their doors too.
Yeah.
These are fiberglass doors. They're not wood, but they've been stained. And the nice thing about fiberglass these days is that it takes a stain like it never used to. But it's what's inside the door too that makes a huge difference.
Take a look at the way this door is built. This is a Plastpro cutaway, and what you'll notice is I've got a composite bottom rail and composite stiles on all 4 edges of that door. And what that allows us to do is we don't have to paint the bottoms and tops of the doors to maintain a warranty. In fact, you don't have to paint your door at all to maintain your warranty.
But let's look at how the bottom rail is constructed. On a typical door, and this isn't a Plastpro door, this is another manufacturer. On a typical bottom rail, the bottom rail stops at the stile. So here's the wood stile, and the wood stile is exposed on the edge. So you got to paint that, and you got to paint the bottoms too because the edge of the stile, the end of the stile, is exposed. But on a Plastpro door,
It's composite the whole way around.
it's continuous. The bottom rail and the top rail are continuous, and the wood stile is capped with a composite cap. So you don't have any exposed wood. And the other beauty to that is when they lay up the fiberglass skin in a plant, they get a molecular bond then between the composite cap, the composite top and bottom rails, so no moisture ever gets inside the door. And that's important because there is wood inside the door.
That's right. Let's take a look at this lock rail here. This is an LVL in this Plastpro cutaway, and it's continuous from the top of the door to the bottom. Most manufacturers don't do that. Most manufacturers have a lock block that's about this big, and it's just there so you can bore your holes for your locking mechanism. Well, with the Plastpro door, like I said, it's continuous. So when I close this door, it sounds like a real door, and it feels like a real door.
A real solid core like a stile and rail door. And that's because of that solid LVL style that's inside every lock style on a Plastpro door. So now let's get into finishing this up because there's one more step, obviously. We got to weather seal the exterior of this opening. Now, you've probably noticed how easy it's been for us to shim this jamb. we were able to shim it and run our shims in both directions because there's no brick mold on this jamb. We never order our jambs with brick mold on them. Jambs never used to come with brick mold on them for a good reason. Brick mold is trim. Trim goes on last. If you put the trim on first, it makes it very difficult to install the frame. It makes it difficult to shim, first of all, because you end up pushing shims in from the back and they hit the back of the brick mold. Then you have to bust them off to get them in position properly, and it's really rare that you can get your shims to just touch each other the right amount with the brick mold in the way. The other problem with brick mold is it makes it really tough to weather seal the jamb to the wall, whether it's a masonry wall like this is or whether it's a wood frame wall. And let me explain to you what this problem really means. Most door manufacturers, in fact every single one of them, has an installation instruction with their door units. Ships out to the job with the doors. The installation instructions always say, because the brick mold is installed on the jamb from the get-go, it comes to the job with the brick mold on it, the installation instructions tell you that you should take your sealant and put 2 beads of sealant on the back of the brick mold, right on the frame. One bead goes right where the brick mold meets the frame to seal that joint, and the other bead goes on the back edge of the brick mold, so that when you install the frame, you push the brick mold up against the masonry wall or up against the wood frame wall, which has house wrap on it, and that way you get a barrier seal. Your sealant squeezes against the helm and you get a sealant bead right there. Now the problem with that approach is, how do you make a final correction for cross leg or a little bit of wind in the doors?
You have a really hard time. It's almost impossible.
You can't. So order your frames bald without the brick mold on. It'll make it easier to install the flashing, make it easier to adjust for cross leg and wind in the doors.
Yeah, if I've got brick mold already attached to the jamb when the door is installed, how do I weatherize that? If there's no brick mold in my way, all I have to do is take my peel and stick tape and stick it right to the edge of the masonry in the buck and also to the edge of the jamb. And I can run that tape right down the edge of the jamb, keeping it back out of the way of where the trim or brick mold will cover. That way the tape is completely covered by the trim, can cut off any excess that we need to, but the point is we can weatherize this opening.
And that's a really cool thing, and the reason that we're using peel and stick flashing here instead of a liquid flashing. A lot of fellows that install jambs in masonry walls like this prefer to use a liquid flashing, which is fine. It applies really easily. You just squeeze it out with a large caulking gun, and you can use a spreader just to spread the flashing out. But the problem with the liquid flashing is it's a little messy, and when you're spreading it out, it can end up back quite a ways on a masonry wall, which is no problem if they're going to veneer the wall or something like that. But if they're going to put like a textured coat on top of the wall, or they're going to paint the wall, it might interfere. The flashing, this liquid flashing, might interfere with the paint adhering to the masonry wall. So we like to use a peel and stick because we can do it more neatly. We can have control over it. Once the brick mold goes on, you can take a sharp utility knife and slice the rest of that flashing off that's sticking out past the brick mold. So all you do is just stick your brick mold on at this point and then slice off the remainder of the flashing. And that finishes up the installation.
Yeah, so do yourself a favor. If you want to flash your doors properly, if you want to install them properly, order your doors with the brick mold Kaydee knocked down and your jambs bald. And if your doors come to your jobs with brick mold on them, go ahead and take the brick mold off. It'll make your installation go so much simpler.
Hey, thank you so much for coming to the IBS show and visiting us at the Plastpro booth. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions, now's the time to ask.